In January of 1921, a fire broke out in the basement of the Commerce Department building in Washington, D.C. The cause was never definitively determined. The investigation considered a discarded cigarette, faulty electrical wiring, and spontaneous combustion of sawdust in the building's workshop. No cause was ever formally assigned. The fire was put out, the damage was assessed, and when the assessment was complete, the archivists understood that something irreplaceable was gone. Stored in that basement, stacked on wooden shelves outside a fireproof vault that sat one room away, were the original schedules of the 1890 federal census. The most detailed population count the United States had ever conducted. 63 million names, 25% burned immediately. Another 50% suffered catastrophic water and smoke damage. The remaining 25% sat in temporary storage while the government decided what to do. For 12 years, nothing happened. No restoration effort, no attempt to copy what remained onto new paper before the damage spread further, no emergency preservation project. The surviving records, perhaps 15 million names, sat in a warehouse while the National Genealogical Society and the Daughters of the American Revolution filed formal protests asking the government to act. The protests are in the congressional record. They were acknowledged. They were not acted on. In February 1933, the chief clerk of the Bureau of the Census sent a memorandum recommending the destruction of the surviving records. The memorandum cited storage costs and the deteriorated condition of the documents. Congress authorized the destruction. By 1934, the 1890 census was gone. Approximately 6,000 names survived in scattered fragments. Now I need to tell you something about the 1890 census that makes this sequence of events difficult to accept as ordinary bureaucratic failure. Every census the United States had conducted from 1790 to 1880 had been stored with redundant copies in local offices across the country. This was standard procedure built into the census process from the beginning, designed specifically to prevent the kind of total loss that had destroyed individual state records in fires and floods throughout the 19th century. When the 1860 census building in Washington burned, the local copies in county courthouses across America survived. When individual county records were damaged, the Washington copies existed as backup. The redundancy had worked repeatedly for a century. The 1890 census was the first census for which the federal government broke from this century-old protocol. The schedules were compiled in Washington and stored in Washington. No copies were sent to local offices. No redundant archive was created. The only copies of 63 million American identities were sitting on wooden shelves in a basement in the Commerce Department building. No one has ever offered a documented explanation for why the protocol changed in 1890. I want to be precise about what I am not saying. I am not saying someone deliberately chose to destroy the 1890 census. I am not saying the fire was set or the protocol was changed with malicious intent, or that anyone in 1890 understood what would be lost if the single copy of those records was destroyed. The evidence does not support those conclusions, and I will not draw them. What I am saying is that the specific year in which the protocol changed, 1890, is the specific year that produced a census unlike any that came before or after in terms of what it would have documented, and that the sequence of decisions that followed the fire, no restoration, 12 years of inaction, authorized destruction, requires the same kind of attention to pattern that the census itself deserves. To understand what the 1890 census would have contained, you need to understand what was happening in America between 1880 and 1890. In 1865, 4 million people were freed from slavery. They emerged from bondage without surnames, without documented family histories, without the paper trail that American civic life assumed every citizen possessed. In the years immediately following emancipation, these families faced the task of constructing legal identities from nothing, choosing surnames, establishing household records, creating the documentary foundation for citizenship. That process was ongoing, incomplete, and chaotic in ways that the 1870 and 1880 censuses had only partially captured. The 1890 census would have been the first census conducted when a significant portion of the formerly enslaved population had been free for 25 years. It would have captured the specific names that families had chosen, the specific communities where they had settled, the specific economic conditions they had achieved or failed to achieve. For millions of Black Americans today who cannot trace their ancestry past the Civil War, the 1890 census would have been the bridge, the document connecting the people who emerged from slavery to the families that descended from them. The genealogists call the gap that exists today the 1870 brick wall. Census records before 1870 do not list enslaved people by name. The 1870 census is the first to list them. But the 1870 census captured people immediately after emancipation, before many families had stabilized their names and locations. The 1880 census is more complete but still early. The 1890 census, taken at the 25-year mark, would have captured the generation in the most useful possible moment, old enough to have established themselves, young enough that many were still alive and identifiable. That census is gone. Now, consider what else was happening in America in 1890 that the census would have captured. Between 1880 and 1890, the largest wave of immigration in American history to that point was underway. Italians, Jews, Poles, Russians, Greeks, and dozens of other nationalities were arriving in numbers that would transform American cities within a generation. These immigrants arrived with names that American bureaucratic systems struggled to record accurately. The process of name change, voluntary and coerced, documented and undocumented, was accelerating through the 1880s and 1890s as immigrants confronted an economic system that rewarded assimilation and punished foreignness. The 1890 census would have captured these families at a specific and critical moment, 5 to 15 years after arrival, before the name changes had fully propagated through the documentary record, when the connection between the old name and the new name was still traceable in living memory and in the documents families carried from their countries of origin. For millions of Americans today who cannot trace their ancestry past the late 19th century because the thread of their family name was cut somewhere in that era, the 1890 census would have been the document most likely to preserve both sides of the cut. That census is gone. And then there were the children. Between 1879 and 1890, the federal government's Indian boarding school system was in its most aggressive phase of expansion. Captain Richard Henry Pratt had opened the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in 1879 with the explicit mandate to destroy Native American cultural identity and replace it with assimilated American identity. By 1890, dozens of schools across the country were operating under the same philosophy, taking children from their families and giving them new names, new religions, new identities. The 1890 census would have been the first census conducted after this system had been operating for a decade. It would have captured Native American children in two places, in the records of their original communities under their original names, and in the records of the boarding schools under the names assigned to them by the schools. The connection between those two identities, the child born into a Native family and the child recorded in a boarding school ledger, would have been traceable in the 1890 census in a way it is not traceable in any other single document. That census is gone. I have spent a long time sitting with this pattern before writing it down. The three populations most affected by the loss of the 1890 census, the formerly enslaved, the recently arrived immigrants, and the native children passing through the boarding school system, are precisely the three populations whose identities were being most actively rewritten in the decade before the census was taken. I cannot tell you that the protocol change that eliminated the redundant copies was related to that fact. The evidence does not establish that connection. What I can tell you is that the 1880 census sat safely in the fireproof vault one room away from the burning 1890 schedules, and that the 1890 census was the only census in American history stored without a backup, and that the populations who would have benefited most from its survival are the populations whose descendants are most likely, today, to hit a wall in their family research at approximately 1890. The pattern is in the record. The explanation is not. In 1934, a government employee in Washington, D.C. carried the last surviving fragments of the 1890 census to a furnace. He was following congressional authorization. The destruction order had been signed. The storage costs had been cited. The deteriorated condition of the documents had been noted. The decision had been made through proper channels, reviewed by the appropriate committees, authorized by the appropriate authority. He was doing his job. What he carried to that furnace was the documentary record of 63 million American lives at a specific moment in time, a moment that was, for specific populations, the most important moment in their entire documentary history. He did not know that. The committee that authorized the destruction did not discuss it in those terms. The memorandum that recommended the destruction cited storage costs. The destruction is documented. The congressional authorization is in the record. The Bureau of the Census memorandum is in the record. The protests from the genealogical societies are in the record. The decision to proceed with destruction despite those protests is in the record. What is not in the record is any indication that anyone in authority understood or asked what would be permanently lost. Now I want to tell you about a specific family, because the abstract scale of 63 million names becomes something different when you trace what the loss meant for one specific lineage. A woman named Ida Mae Garland was born in 1887 in Coahoma County, Mississippi. Her parents were Solomon Garland and Martha Garland, both formerly enslaved. Solomon had been born into slavery approximately in 1851. Martha had been born into slavery approximately in 1855. The approximate dates reflect the reality that enslaved people were not documented as individuals in federal records. They appeared in census schedules as numbers under their enslaver's name until 1870. The 1870 census lists Solomon Garland by name for the first time. He is 19 years old. The 1880 census lists him again, now with Martha and their first children. By 1890, Solomon and Martha would have been in their late 30s and early 40s. Their children would have been reaching adulthood. The specific details of their household, the names of all their children, their occupations, the value of their property, the precise location of their farm, would have been in the 1890 census. That census does not exist. Ida Mae Garland's descendants, researching their family today, can find Solomon in 1870 and 1880. They cannot find the family in 1890. The next record is the 1900 census, by which point Solomon may have died. His death, if it occurred in the 1890s, is not in any record that researchers have been able to locate. The thread of his life goes dark in the decade covered by the destroyed census. Ida Mae's story is representative. It is not exceptional. It is the story of millions of Black American families whose genealogical research terminates in exactly this gap, the decade between 1880 and 1900 that the 1890 census would have illuminated. The Family Search Genealogical Database, which has digitized census records going back to 1790, shows a specific and measurable anomaly in Black American family research. The connection rate between 1880 records and 1900 records is significantly lower than the connection rate for any other decade in American genealogical history. The gap is not random. It corresponds precisely to the population that would have been most documented in the 1890 census and most affected by its absence. This is documented in the academic literature on genealogy and African American history. It is not speculation. It is a measurable effect of a specific archival loss on a specific population. Now, I want to tell you about the protocol change, because the more I looked at it, the stranger it became. The Census Act of 1879 established the legal framework for the 1880 census and its successors. The act specified that census schedules were to be deposited with the clerk of each county, creating the local redundancy that had protected census data for a century. The 1880 census was conducted under this framework. The local copies were deposited, the Washington copies were stored. Both survived. Before the 1890 census, Congress passed the Census Act of 1890. Among its provisions was a change to the storage protocol. The schedules would be deposited with the superintendent of the census in Washington rather than with county clerks. The local redundancy was eliminated. The congressional debate on this provision is in the congressional record. The rationale given was administrative efficiency. Centralizing the records in Washington would simplify the Census Bureau's work. The possibility of total loss from a single fire in a single building was not discussed in the recorded debate. I want to be careful here because this is the point at which it would be easy to draw a conclusion the evidence does not support. The 1890 Census Act was passed by a Congress that was not thinking about what would happen if the building burned. Administrative efficiency was a genuine concern. The federal government in 1890 was centralizing many functions that had previously been handled locally. The protocol change fits that pattern. And yet, the 1880 census, conducted under the old protocol with local copies, sat safely in the fireproof vault one room away from the burning 1890 schedules. If the 1890 census had been conducted under the same protocol as every previous census, copies would have existed in county courthouses across the country. The fire in the Commerce Department basement would have destroyed the Washington copies. The county copies would have survived. 63 million names would still exist. That is not what happened. What happened is that the one census conducted without the redundant local copies was the one census whose Washington copy was destroyed by fire. The sequence is documented. The protocol change is in the Census Act of 1890. The fire is in the official record. The destruction order is in the congressional record. The protests from genealogical societies are in the congressional record. The decision to proceed with destruction is in the record. The reason the protocol changed in 1890 and not in any other year is not in the record, at least not in any record I have found. Here is what the fire and the subsequent destruction cost in concrete terms for American families today. The National Archives estimates that the 1890 census would have documented approximately 12.7 million immigrants, people who had arrived in the United States between 1880 and 1890, the peak decade of the great wave of Southern and Eastern European immigration. For the descendants of those immigrants, the 1890 census would have been the document most likely to show both the original name the immigrant arrived with and the Americanized name they were using by 1890, capturing the moment of transition that subsequent censuses only showed one side of. The archives also estimate that the 1890 census would have included the most detailed enumeration of Native American populations ever conducted to that point, including specific records from reservation communities and boarding schools that would have created traceable connections between individuals and their tribal origins. And it would have included the specific occupational and property data for formerly enslaved families at the 25-year mark of freedom, data that researchers today use to study the economic outcomes of emancipation, and that, for the 1890 decade, simply does not exist in comparable form. 3 populations. 3 specific and irreplaceable documentary losses, 1 census, 1 fire, 1 destruction order. I have been trying for weeks to find documentation that explains why the 1890 census was stored without local backups when every previous census had been stored with them. The Census Act of 1890 is in the congressional record. The debate on the act is in the congressional record. The administrative efficiency rationale is in the debate. What is not in the debate or in any administrative record I have found is an acknowledgement that eliminating the redundancy created a risk of total loss. Maybe no one thought about it. The 19th century did not have a sophisticated understanding of archival risk management. Building fires were common, but not considered an existential threat to records stored in what was believed to be a fireproof building. The fireproof vault that protected the 1880 census was fireproof. The wooden shelves outside it were not. The distinction, which records went inside the vault and which went on the shelves, was made by someone whose name is not in the record I have found. The 1880 census went inside the vault. The 1890 census went on the shelves. That decision is the pivot on which everything else turns. Whoever made it, for whatever reason, created the conditions for the most significant archival loss in American history. The pattern is there. I cannot tell you what it means. I can tell you that the populations most affected by the loss are the populations whose documentary histories were most fragile in 1890, the people whose names were newest, whose records were most incomplete, whose connection to the documentary infrastructure of American civic life was most recently established. The 1880 census is at the Family History Library and on Ancestry.com. The 1900 census is there too. Between them, where the 1890 census should be, there is a gap. It shows up as a decade in your family tree where the thread goes dark. If your family was black or immigrant or Native American in 1890, that gap is probably in your tree. It is not because your ancestors did not exist. It is because the document that would have captured them was stored on wooden shelves instead of inside the fireproof vault one room away. The Census Act of 1890 is in the Congressional Record. The Fire Investigation Report is in the National Archives. The Destruction Authorization is in the Congressional Record. The protests from genealogical societies that were overruled are in the Congressional Record. The explanation for why the protocol changed is not there. Maybe it was efficiency. Maybe it was oversight. Maybe someone made a filing decision on a Tuesday afternoon in 1890 without understanding what was at stake. The documents that would answer that question were stored on the wooden shelves. The 6,000 surviving fragments of the 1890 census are at the National Archives. They are digitized and searchable on Ancestry.com under 1890 United States Federal Census. If your family name appears in those fragments, it means the specific schedule containing their names was in the portion that survived the fire and the water damage and the 12 years of inaction and the destruction order. Most families are not in the fragments. The fragments are 6,000 names out of 63 million. The 1880 census and the 1900 census are complete and searchable. If your family tree has a gap between those two censuses, if you can find your ancestors in 1880 and lose them until 1900, that gap is the shape of what was lost. It has a name in genealogical research. They call it the 1890 wall. The Census Act of 1890 is in the Congressional Record at congress.gov. The Fire Investigation Report is in the National Archives under the Commerce Department records. The Destruction Authorization is in the Congressional Record for the 72nd Congress. The reason the protocol changed is not there. Subscribe. Because next week we open another file.